So we are now halfway through February of 2020, and everyone's still looking for PlayStation 5 news. I think we're just ready to see the thing, to be honest. I think that's the biggest thing people would like to see right now is the console, games, and the price. How much is this thing going to cost? Because we're asking the same thing about the Series X right now, but we've also seen that system. We've seen at least a game announced for that system. We also know Halo Infinite is coming alongside of Hellblade 2, which is the one game that they seem to show off next to it at the Game Awards. But the PS5 keeps coming up as, like, what's going on? It's a mystery. Well, because of that, outside of those Wired articles that we've received, it seems like we hear more and more information about the PS5 from other publications and other sources that are not Sony. Like, it's strange right now. But hey, that seems to be what happens for a lot of build-ups to different systems. You get rumors, you get reports, you get all kinds of stuff, and then eventually the company shows it, and we know exactly what happened, who was right, who was wrong, all of that. So let's talk a little bit about a new report that has come out. It's from Bloomberg, done by Takashi Machizuki, who we've been following on this channel for quite a while. Since like the NX days, since the early Switch days where the reveal happened and all kinds of information there. He's been following a lot of different outlets and media in Japan and been very, very close to supply lines and different manufacturers. So when he has had different reports to talk about, it's generally pretty good sourcing, but I will point out he's been wrong on some things and correct on many others. But this would explain quite a few things. It would explain why Sony might be kind of quiet, or at least has been quiet, why they might be this quiet right now, as opposed to being a bit louder about, their new system and their new console generation starting at the end of this year in like 8 or 9 months. So let's take a look at the article here. Before we get into it, guys, if you enjoy the video, make sure you like it if you enjoy it and it's interesting to you, and subscribe down below with the red button so we can push towards 400,000 subscribers. The title of this article, this report, is Sony is struggling with PlayStation 5 price due to costly parts. There is a link down below in the description if you wanted to read through it as well and check some things out. But right away, they hit us with scarce components have pushed the manufacturing costs for Sony's next PlayStation to around $450 per unit, forcing a difficult price-setting decision in its battle with Microsoft. Yes, $450 per unit is quite pricey. Now, the Xbox One X was roughly $441 for parts after people managed to get a hold of it, part it out, price it, and see what everything cost. So this is close to that. It's a little more expensive technically, but it would still probably be a $500 system. The Xbox One X was still $500 despite being $441 in manufacturing cost, because there are other things on top of that, logistics, shipping. There's a lot of other things around it outside of just what the parts cost that go together, and that is pretty much up to Sony and what they want to spend that money on and what they want to get it to. But they would also look to probably make some money on this thing. So I wouldn't be shocked if a $450 unit, after everything else on top of that, ends up being a $500 system. Now, Takashi does a good job pointing out that Sony usually finalizes the console's price. So the PS4, the PS4 Pro, for example, all those, in February of that release year, to give them a large enough window in order to get manufacturing rolling. They lock down all the parts. They say, okay, this is what we are going to sell this thing for, and that's because X, Y, and Z cost this much, and we're going to get this all done. Factories can only pump out so many systems in a day, so they have to basically do the math and figure out, okay, how long is it going to take us to create 1, 2, or 3 million units for our initial couple of shipments, and then they start and get it all sorted and ready to roll for different regions, because they might be doing like a worldwide launch. So it does take time and quite a bit of it to get it all done. So that's why they would get the price locked down, and they would start to do manufacturing in the spring of that year, and then throughout the summer into the fall, and then be ready for, say, a November launch, which is still kind of when I think they'll be doing it. Now, the price discussion is always going to be interesting, at least up until we have both of them announcing them. I think if Sony is waiting for Microsoft, as has been alluded to with this article, and many people have been kind of pulling from their on their conference call, they mentioned they're going to be looking around at basically factors in the market, and that would be Microsoft, to determine their pricing. Microsoft probably is not going to announce that until E3. And if they have something big planned, like I think with what they're talking about for that Series X, if they do show up with a $500 pricing on that, and they have a Lockhart system, which is a lower system, but at $300, That will be very tough, I do believe, for Sony to match. You have a system that costs the same as the Series X, but it's weaker. And then you also have a system across the table with Microsoft and Lockhart that is believing to be around $300. You don't win on price. You don't win on performance. You'd have to show up with really, really good games. That is the only way to win this thing, or at least come out looking good. That's all you can really do. Now, Sony isn't going to go to E3, so they could literally let Microsoft announce their price there and then show up like 3 weeks later and say, oh, here's our price. Just put it out a statement online. I guess that's the one benefit to not going to E3 for Sony, is they're not forced into a situation where they have to call an audible at the last minute or literally announce a price that is going to be like what happened with Microsoft back in 2013 at E3, where they got blindsided by the PS4, where the PS4 was more powerful and it was cheaper. Also, a $500 PS5 would be very interesting to see Sony with, because they've been kind of used to that $400 pricing now. They've seen success with it. The PS3 was $600. That was not good. They lost a ton of money on that system. It was a really bad period for Sony. There was a point in time where people were worried that the PlayStation brand was going to go under. Seriously, it got to that point. So for Sony to have to come out with just a single SKU system at $500, I have to imagine even they are a little nervous about that. But I do think the PlayStation brand is strong enough now for them to probably get away with it. Just stay away from $600. Just keep it within reason. I think the Xbox One X showed us that people will still go out there and buy a $500 system, but this would be the only one on the market from PlayStation. And if you want to play like the latest games, like whatever Blue Point has, for example, or maybe there's another God of War or something, or Spider-Man 2 or Horizon Zero Dawn 2, you got to get the next PlayStation. Most people will say, okay, I guess I'll just spend $500 and get it then, because I want to play these games. Games always sell systems, and we've seen it time and time again. We've seen this happen already, and it actually had to do with the Switch, when Apple seemed to be pushing Nintendo around a little bit when it came to NAND flash memory and other things. Remember, we heard about Apple actually putting in so many orders for those chips that Nintendo was struggling a little bit there, and there was a bit of a concern that there would be a shortage for the Switch, and it seemed like Nintendo made some kind of deal in the backroom deal or something and managed to kind of circumvent that. But check this out, because it looks like Sony is actually having some struggles right now. They say their company's biggest headache is ensuring a reliable supply of DRAM and NAND flash memory, with both in high demand as smartphone makers gear up for 5th generation devices, according to people familiar with Sony's operations. Samsung, of course, just announced its Galaxy S20 product range, each variant of which will have 5G and a minimum 12 gigabytes of RAM in the US. By the way, cell phones have gotten ridiculous, right? It is insane to think about how much RAM they have in there and how many chips and RAM modules they would have in those phones. Now, they are also limited by the size of the motherboard inside, so they might double up or have multiple like 2, 3, 4 gigabyte chips in there. But what's odd about this situation, it is technically the cell phone affecting a home console, right? It's something you don't really think too much about, but all these RAM chips got to come from somewhere, right? And we do hear that these new systems will most likely have GDDR6 memory, and they're going to be very powerful, but they will require quite a bit of DRAM, several modules, and if they're going to go with 16 gigabytes, they could end up with, they could end up with 8, right? They could end up with 8 chips on their board. They could end up with 4. There could be several kind. Or they could just do what the Xbox One X did and have 12 1 gigabyte or 16 1 gigabyte chips. In this case, it's going to be all over the place, and it'll be very interesting to see how these variations, or these configurations, I should say, end up when we take it apart at the end of this year, provided nothing gets pushed back. The delays are always possible. I doubt it, though, because they keep saying holiday. Both sides do, Microsoft and Sony, over and over and over again. So I do expect them to be here at holiday, and it'll be interesting to open them up and see how they configure all of this stuff, especially when we're hearing about the cost measures here and competition with cell phones. And then, of course, we also know that Sony will have an SSD inside of the PlayStation 5, something that they have talked about actually a bit more extensively, and could be one of the big jumps from this generation to next generation. Of course, them trying to eliminate load times, or at least drop them down significantly. Well, you start trying to source the parts for SSDs inside of it, maybe you want a 1 terabyte drive inside, it does become more and more expensive trying to source those chips on top of any RAM you would need for the system. And then maybe they have it even split up between, say, 4 gigabytes of DDR4 for the system memory, and then they have 12 gigabytes of GDDR6, and you're playing with all these different memory types. You're trying to kind of group them all together while you're fighting off different cell phone manufacturers. Yeah, you can kind of see how this can be a little difficult to get everything together at a reasonable price. Cell phones can technically push these consoles around, whether it's Sony, I guess Microsoft, although Microsoft hasn't really mentioned having any real issues with this, and I guess Sony didn't either, but it seemed like it makes sense for Sony considering they haven't done much with the PlayStation or said a lot or shown a lot. But it's something to think about with these cell phone companies. I mean, consider Samsung in 2018, they sold nearly, and I'm not even kidding, nearly 300 million handset devices or their phones, for example, smartphones. 300 million. That is insane, isn't it? And they all need RAM, right? They all need flash memory. You can kind of see how Samsung can control the market over a company like Sony that might need, 15 million PlayStation 5s, 20 million PlayStation 5s in a year. And you see manufacturers of RAM and flash memory and stuff, and they're like, yeah, but Samsung wants to order 300 million chips from us. So we're going to allot a lot of our resources to them because they'll keep us in business better. I also want to point out this sentence here saying Sony's chief executive officer, Kenichiro Yoshida, has said the business should be judged by the number of active users, not the number of hardware units sold. That sounds like something Phil Spencer and Microsoft would say. Yeah, Sony has been very good about moving hardware, specifically PlayStation systems. 3 out of their 4 generations were over 100 million units. Now that the PlayStation 4 has passed it with the PS3, which was terrible out of the gate. Like, they tied their shoes together and fell over out of the gate, basically, for the PlayStation 3. Even with that slip up, they weren't that far off for 100 million. So they've always been very good at moving units. It is interesting to hear them say it should be judged by the number of active users. Although I guess to them, they're saying, hey, that's where a lot of our money comes from. Recurring revenue on network services, this is their biggest thing right now. And of course, selling through software where they will report over 1 billion units of software selling. Yes, that's where the majority of their money is coming from. It's just interesting to hear them sound a bit like Microsoft right there. Oh, and this was an interesting little bit here as well, saying most of the components for the console have been locked down, the people said, including the cooling system, which is unusually expensive at a few dollars per unit. Yes, generally, I'm going to say generally because I think the Xbox One X spent some money on their cooling. They had the vapor chamber and they were up on stage saying liquid cooled, and it's not really liquid cooled, but liquid cooled. And they really put that heatsink over. And I'll admit, when I took the Xbox One X apart, that thing is heavy. There is some weight to that, and there is quite a bit going on there, and it's obviously set up pretty well, as the Xbox One X, being a 6 teraflop machine, it's pretty quiet. It's definitely more quiet than the PS4 Pro that sounds like it wants to go upright and shoot off into orbit whenever anything happens on screen when you're playing any game at that point. But they say that they want to put a little more money into the heatsink, which makes me believe they could go something similar to what the Xbox One X is doing inside of its system, or maybe even a bit more complicated, and maybe they could build it out even further. Because if we look at, say, the PS4 Pro's heatsink, yeah, this is it right here. I mean, it's a very basic heatsink, and it's not great for cooling what is a fairly large and hot chip. It just, you see the side effect. You see what happens. Your fan gets very, very loud, right? And that's because that was a cost-cutting measure, was the heatsink. Probably cost them, like they said, less than $1. They also point out that Sony is looking to release their PlayStation VR 2 headset sometime after the PS5. Not too surprising to hear about that, at all. I think most of us figured a PlayStation VR 2 is coming. They even said that the original PlayStation VR will be backwards compatible, or forwards compatible, I guess, with the new PlayStation 5 system. So that's good to hear. I think that VR 2 headset's going to be kind of pricey, $400 to $500 on its own. So that is something I guess makes sense to hold off until 2021. But something I noticed here, and this caught me off guard a little bit. Apparently Sony is so serious about getting this PS5 done, and they're having so many troubles and issues with DRAM. It says Sony has already canceled some previously planned features for a new mirrorless camera due this year, owing to the constrained DRAM supply, several people with knowledge of the matter have said. So they are actively basically stopping production or plans in a whole other sector of Sony, which would be for their cameras, which is, their cameras do pretty well for them still. It doesn't make as much money as what PlayStation does, and a lot of that has to do with PlayStation's network services, but still, they are so serious and focused and struggling even at times, according to this report, that they are actively going out to other sectors to hold it back because of this DRAM supply issue. That is surprising. That's how you know the matter is serious. When it comes to this, they are stopping cameras. Sony is halting camera production to try to get the PS5 out in time and at a good price. Now, to finish up the article, they said that, hey, it's going to come down to Microsoft. What is Microsoft going to price their Series X at? And that is going to be a big deal. What can they do here? Because I don't think Microsoft is going to drop it below $500. There have been talks of $600. If Microsoft launches the Series X at $600, Sony will catch a massive break. They really, really will. I think the Series X is going to be $500, and I do believe that Sony is going to price theirs at $500. I think $450 is a weird pricing. I know there's like psychology and stuff when it comes to sticker price and all this stuff, and they like to try to get it at basically an even $100 mark, and they take away a penny to be smart about it at $399.9 or whatever, or $499.9. But I think the PS5 is going to be $500 as well, and I believe it'll probably be weaker. And will that matter? I mean, I'd like to say no, but I guess it really just comes down to the games. What can they show off? Can the talent from Sony's divisions make up for what could possibly be a 20% power gap? I do believe so, right? So that's the biggest thing. If you show up with functionality with VR, because that could be added, the following year or, months down the line, you show up with the games. Yes, I think you can show that there is a need for the PlayStation 5, even if it's the same price as the Xbox, but not as powerful. I think we're getting to a point now where it's harder and harder for consumers to see the difference in some of these visuals. We're talking about like 8K resolution and ray tracing. I think at least is something you can point out, but it's still not as noticeable to the common person who is just playing Madden or Call of Duty and stuff like that. That actually makes up quite a bit of Sony's overall hardware base, are people that buy a few games a year, and PlayStation was just the default system. So as long as they can keep that mentality over and around their brand, I think they'll still outsell Microsoft's system, even if they are the same price. The part where it will become fascinating to watch is if there is an Xbox Lockhart Series, they can't call it Series L, Series S. If they do have that at $300, will that price difference, right? Because they'll play the same games then from third parties. Will that price difference really give Microsoft the advantage? Or will people still say, well, it's PlayStation, I'll spend the extra money, right? I think people will still spend the extra money and get that PlayStation because of that brand. But let me know what you guys think about this, because according to this report, we're just about locked into a $500 price point for Sony's PlayStation 5. Very curious what you guys think about this. Make sure you like the video on the way out if you enjoyed it. Dislike it if not. Hopefully, we will get some actual PlayStation information, news, a picture of the system from Sony soon. I mean, we're going to be buying the thing in 8 to 9 months, right? So here's hoping in the next month or two, we'll at least see something about the system from Sony. Thanks, guys, for watching. I'll see you next time.